I never intended to go to war with a homeowners association. All I wanted was peace beside the water. When I purchased my grandfather's old cabin on the eastern shore of Lake Clearwater 2 years ago, I was looking for a quiet retreat from my tech job in the city. Grandpa Tom had left it to me in his will along with the 5 acres of wooded land that stretched from the rustic 2-bedroom cabin down to the water's edge. The property had been in our family since the 1950s, long before the fancy development called Clearwater Estates sprung up on the north side of the lake. The cabin needed work, lots of it. The roof leaked, the deck was rotting, and the plumbing was questionable at best. But it sat on prime lakefront land with a small private dock where Grandpa and I used to fish during those magical summers of my childhood. The property also included a narrow strip of land that ran along the shoreline for about a quarter mile, a seemingly insignificant detail on the property survey that would later prove crucial. 3 months into my renovation project, while installing new windows, I noticed a Mercedes SUV pull into my gravel driveway. A woman in her mid-60s emerged, dressed like she was heading to a country club luncheon rather than visiting a construction site. "Hello there," she called with a saccharine smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Margot Williamson, president of the Clearwater Estates Homeowners Association." I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I climbed down from my ladder and extended a dusty hand. "Jack Parker, nice to meet you." She hesitated before briefly touching my fingers with hers. "Mr. Parker, I wanted to personally welcome you to our community and drop off our association bylaws." She handed me a thick binder. "Since you're renovating, I thought it would be helpful to review our architectural guidelines. All exterior modifications need board approval." I frowned. "I'm not part of Clearwater Estates. This is my grandfather's old property." Her smile tightened. "Well, technically this entire lakefront falls under our jurisdiction now. The association was formed 15 years ago. I'm sure the previous owner, your grandfather, was sent notification. He never mentioned anything about an HOA, and I've checked all the property documents. There's nothing about this cabin being part of any association." Margot's smile vanished entirely. "That's simply not possible. All lakefront properties are part of Clearwater Estates. Our members pay good money to maintain the pristine nature of this community." She gestured toward my half-finished deck and the stack of lumber in the yard. "Speaking of which, we do have regulations about unsightly construction materials being visible from the lake." It was the first warning shot in what would become a prolonged battle. As she left, she paused by her car. "Oh, and the association beach party is this Saturday at the North Shore. All residents are expected to attend." It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. That night, I dug through Grandpa's old filing cabinet and found the original deed and property survey. Nowhere did it mention any homeowners association, but something else caught my eye. That strip of land along the shore was wider than I thought, and it extended all the way to the small peninsula where the community beach for Clearwater Estates was located. I had a feeling I'd be seeing more of Margot Williamson very soon. The official warning letter arrived 3 days later, printed on expensive cream stationery with the Clearwater Estates embossed logo, a stylized image of pine trees reflected in water. "Dear Mr. Parker," it began, "it has come to our attention that unauthorized construction is taking place on your property without proper approval from the Architectural Review Committee. Additionally, several violations have been noted: excessive construction debris visible from common areas, unapproved exterior paint selection, cabin exterior, non-conforming dock structure, and boat storage not in compliance with Section 4.3 of the bylaws. Failure to remedy these violations within 7 days will result in fines of $100 per day per violation." The letter was signed by Margot, with copies to the other board members. Names I didn't recognize except for one: Senator James Holloway. I hadn't realized we had state politicians living in the area. I decided to attend their next meeting, which conveniently was scheduled for that evening at the Clearwater Estates Clubhouse, a pretentious colonial-style building overlooking the North Shore. When I walked in, conversations immediately hushed. About 20 residents were seated in neat rows of chairs, most in their 50s or older, dressed in casual but clearly expensive clothing. Margaret stood at a podium at the front. Flanking her were 4 other board members, including a distinguished gray-haired man I recognized from campaign billboards as Senator Holloway. "Ah, Mr. Parker," Margaret announced. "How nice of you to join us." Her tone suggested it was anything but nice. "We were just discussing the importance of architectural consistency around the lake." "Actually," I said, taking a vacant seat in the back row, "I'd wanted to discuss this warning letter. My property is not part of your HOA." The room erupted in murmurs. Margot rapped a gavel sharply. "Mr. Parker, this is a misconception we need to clear up. Your grandfather may have been, let's say, grandfathered in with certain exceptions, but when ownership transferred, the property legally became part of Clearwater Estates. I've reviewed all the documentation. There's nothing indicating my property was ever annexed into your association." Senator Holloway cleared his throat. "Son, I'm an attorney by profession, and I can assure you that the lake zoning ordinances passed in 2008 incorporated all shoreline properties into the association. It was widely publicized at the time. With all due respect, Senator, zoning doesn't automatically create HOA membership. You need a deed restriction or a voluntary agreement." The senator's face darkened. "Perhaps we should discuss this in private after the meeting." "I'm happy to discuss it here," I replied. "Also, I'm curious about the community dock and beach area. According to my survey, it appears to be partially on my land." The room fell completely silent. Margaret's face flushed deep red. "That's absurd," she snapped. "The community areas are association property. I have the original survey and deed. Maybe your association would like to show me the documentation that transferred that land to your control." Margot abruptly changed the subject. "We need to move on to other business. Mr. Parker, we'll have our attorney contact you." As the meeting continued, I noticed several residents giving me curious glances. One elderly gentleman in particular, introduced during the meeting as Walter Jenkins, a retired judge, studied me with what seemed like amused interest. As I left, Walter approached me in the parking lot. "You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest, young man," he said quietly. "Margot runs this place like a personal fiefdom. Some of us have been waiting for someone to stand up to her." He handed me his card. "Call me if you need some friendly advice." The battle lines were drawn, but I had no idea how dirty this fight was about to get. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of a truck engine outside my cabin. Through the window, I spotted a Clearwater Estates maintenance vehicle parked at the end of my dock. 2 men were attaching bright orange violation notices to my dock posts and the small shed where I kept fishing gear. I pulled on jeans and a t-shirt and rushed down to confront them. "What do you think you're doing on my property?" I demanded. The older of the 2 men, his uniform indicated he was Carl, the facilities manager, looked uncomfortable. "Sorry, Mr. Parker. Just following orders from the board. They declared your dock non-compliant with safety regulations." "You're trespassing," I said firmly. "Remove those notices and get off my property now." "Sir, we're authorized by the association tow. I'm not part of your association. This is private property." The younger worker looked nervously at Carl. "Maybe we should call Mrs. Williamson." "That won't be necessary," came a voice from behind me. I turned to see Walter Jenkins approaching along the shoreline path. "Carl, I believe Mr. Parker has made his position clear." Carl hesitated, clearly torn between conflicting authorities. "Judge Jenkins, Mrs. Williamson was very specific. And I'm being very specific now," Walter replied calmly. "Unless you have a court order, you're currently trespassing on private property. As a retired judge, I wouldn't recommend continuing. The maintenance men retreated, leaving the violation notices behind. I pulled them down as Walter, and I watched the truck depart. "Thank you," I said, turning to Walter. "But I'm guessing this will only make things worse." Walter nodded grimly. "Margot doesn't like to lose. Neither does Senator Holloway. Their families were among the founders of Clearwater Estates, and they've been gradually expanding their control for years." He gazed out at the lake. "Several of the original property owners, like your grandfather, refused to join their association. They've been waiting for the old-timers to die off so they can force the heirs to comply." "They picked the wrong heir," I said. "I'm not selling, and I'm not joining." Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment intensified. My mail mysteriously didn't get delivered. When I had building supplies delivered, the trucks were inexplicably redirected to the wrong address. A county inspector showed up claiming to have received complaints about unauthorized septic work, though I'd done nothing to the septic system. Then I met Elena Rodriguez, my closest neighbor about a quarter mile down the shore. She owned one of the other original pre-HOA cabins. "They've been after me for years," Elena confided when she stopped by to introduce herself. "Started with complaints about my non-conforming boat dock, then escalated to fines for my vegetable garden being visible from the water. Last month they tried to prevent my daughter's quinceañera celebration, claiming the party tent violated some obscure height restriction." "How do you handle it?" I asked. "I fight where I can, ignore what I can't prove," she said with a shrug. "But it's exhausting. I've considered selling, which is exactly what they want. Margot's son is a real estate developer. Every original property they acquire gets torn down for one of those monstrosities." She pointed across the lake to the massive modern homes that had replaced most of the original cabins. That evening, I received an official-looking letter from the county zoning office, claiming my dock required permits that had never been obtained. The dock had been there for over 40 years. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, but when I called the county office the next morning, they confirmed the letter was legitimate. "Someone submitted historical satellite images showing modifications to your dock in 2010, the clerk explained. The dock hadn't been modified since the 1990s. I was beginning to understand the extent of Margot and Senator Holloway's influence in the county. But they were about to discover that I had resources of my own, and a stubborn streak wider than the lake itself. The situation reached critical mass on a sweltering July afternoon. I had taken a week off work to focus on the cabin renovations, determined to finish the deck before returning to the city. Elena's teenage son Miguel was helping me, earning some summer cash. We were securing the last of the deck railings when 3 sheriff's department vehicles pulled into my driveway, lights flashing. "Mr. Jack Parker," called a deputy as he approached. "That's me." "Sir, we have a court order to cease and desist all construction activities on this property." He handed me an official-looking document. "You're in violation of county building codes and lakefront development regulations." I quickly scanned the order. It had been signed by Judge Raymond Phillips, who, according to Walter, was Senator Holloway's former law partner. "This is bogus," I said. "I have all the necessary permits." "That may be, sir, but until this is resolved in court, no further construction can take place. We're also authorized to post notices regarding potential daily fines." As the deputies began placing official notices around my property, a sleek BMW pulled in behind them. Margot emerged, alongside a younger man in an expensive suit who resembled her. "Mr. Parker," she called with poorly concealed satisfaction. "This is my son, Brandon Williamson. He's an attorney specializing in property law. Perhaps now you'll be willing to discuss a reasonable solution." Brandon stepped forward with a business card and a predatory smile. "My client, Clearwater Estates HOA, is prepared to make a generous offer on your property. Given the legal complications you're facing, it might be the most sensible path forward." I felt my blood boiling but kept my voice steady. "Not interested." You should know that fighting this could take years, Brandon continued smoothly. The legal fees alone would likely exceed the value of this rustic dwelling. Meanwhile, you won't be able to continue renovations or even use your dock, which I understand has been declared unsafe. Miguel, who had been silently watching, whispered, "They did the same thing to Mr. Gonzalez last year. He sold for half what his place was worth." Margot's smug expression, as she surveyed my half-finished deck, was the final straw. "Let me be perfectly clear," I said loudly enough for the deputies to hear. "I'm not selling. Not now, not ever. This property has been in my family for 3 generations, and I intend to keep it that way." "Such sentiment," Margot said dismissively. "But sentiment doesn't hold up well against county regulations and court orders. Brandon, leave Mr. Parker your card. He'll be calling soon enough when reality sets in." As they drove away, one of the deputies approached me. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "they pull this stunt every summer against someone. Not everyone at the department is happy about being used as their private enforcers." That evening, I sat on my unfinished deck as darkness fell, looking out over the lake. The lights from the massive homes of Clearwater Estates reflected on the water's surface. They thought they had me cornered. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't just any tech worker from the city. I was the chief security officer for one of the largest cybersecurity firms in the country, with resources and connections of my own. And they had just pushed me past the point of playing nice. I pulled out my laptop and began to work. First, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with: the true property boundaries, the history of the HOA formation, and most importantly, who really owned the land beneath that precious community beach and the access road that led to it. By dawn, I had my answer and my plan. My first call was to my company's legal department. As a senior executive, I had certain privileges, including consultation with our formidable team of corporate attorneys. I explained the situation and emailed them copies of my grandfather's original deed, the property survey, and the questionable court order. "This is fascinating," said Diane Wu, our head of legal affairs, during our video call. "Based on these documents, not only is your property clearly not part of their HOA, but you actually own the land underneath part of what they're calling their community beach and dock. And more interestingly, you own a 15-foot wide strip that their access road crosses. Can they claim adverse possession or an easement?" I asked. "Unlikely. Your grandfather granted a revocable license for access in 1997, according to this document. But it specifically states it can be revoked by the property owner at any time with 30 days' notice. There's no prescriptive easement because your grandfather gave permission. It wasn't hostile use." My next call was to an old college friend who now worked for the State Attorney General's office. I explained the situation without mentioning names. "Sounds like potential abuse of power and corruption if an elected official is involved," she said. "We've been looking for cases like this. Would you be willing to file a formal complaint?" "Absolutely." Over the next 3 days, I worked remotely while methodically building my case. I hired a professional surveyor to reconfirm the boundaries of my property. I filed formal complaints with the State Bar Association against Brandon Williamson for ethics violations and with the county against Judge Phillips for conflict of interest in signing the court order. I also reached out to Elena and discovered there were 5 other original property owners who had been fighting similar battles with the HOA. We formed a coalition and pooled resources to hire a specialized law firm with experience fighting predatory HOAs. Walter Jenkins proved invaluable, introducing me to former board members who had been pushed out by Margot's faction. They provided damning evidence of financial irregularities within the HOA, including inflated contracts awarded to companies owned by board members' relatives. But my masterstroke came when I discovered, through careful research of county records, that the Clearwater Estates OA had never properly registered certain required documents. This potentially invalidated many of their bylaws and called into question their authority to issue fines or enforce regulations. While my legal team prepared formal filings, I took one more significant step. I posted legal notices at the boundaries of my property, including the strip of land that ran underneath their access road and part of their beach. Private property. Access by permission only. Permission will be revoked effective August 15. The notices included citations to the relevant property laws and a copy of my deed and survey. The reaction was swift and furious. Brandon Williamson left threatening voicemails. Margot attempted to have the notices removed, only to be stopped by the sheriff's deputy, who had quietly become sympathetic to our cause after reviewing the evidence I compiled. The HOA called an emergency meeting, which I attended along with Elena and Walter. Senator Holloway was conspicuously absent, having been advised by his political consultants to distance himself from the brewing scandal. "This is blackmail," Margot sputtered when I calmly presented my evidence to the assembled residents. "You can't cut off access to the community beach." "I'm not cutting off anything," I replied. "I'm simply asserting my property rights, the same rights your association claims to be protecting. The difference is my claims are legally valid." Brandon tried to intimidate the crowd. "Don't listen to him. We'll fight this in court." "Please do," I responded. "I've already filed motions to invalidate your court order based on judicial conflict of interest. I've also submitted evidence to the State Attorney General regarding potential corruption and abuse of power. Oh, and the IRS might be interested in some of the financial discrepancies in the HOA books that have been brought to my attention." The room erupted in chaos as residents began shouting questions at the board. Years of frustration with Margot's heavy-handed approach were bubbling to the surface. I nodded to Walter, who stood up. His reputation as a retired judge gave his words weight as he addressed his neighbors. "I've reviewed Mr. Parker's evidence," he announced. "His claims appear valid. Moreover, I believe our board has been operating outside its legal authority for some time. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence and the formation of an interim board to negotiate a fair resolution." The revolution had begun. The following days witnessed the rapid disintegration of Margot's power structure. The formerly unified board fractured as members scrambled to protect themselves. Brandon Williamson received formal notice that he was under investigation by the State Bar Association for ethical violations, including attempting to use legal intimidation for financial gain and potential collusion with Judge Phillips. Senator Holloway issued a carefully worded statement claiming he had limited involvement in HOA matters and was troubled by the allegations being investigated. Political survival instincts had kicked in, and he was cutting Margot loose. Meanwhile, my legal team filed motions to invalidate the court order against my construction activities, citing judicial misconduct. Judge Phillips recused himself from all related matters as the Judicial Ethics Committee opened an inquiry. The HOA's insurance company, alarmed by the potential liability, assigned their own attorneys who advised immediate settlement negotiations. Their lawyer called mine with a simple message: "What does your client want?" What I wanted was surprisingly simple: formal acknowledgement that my property was not subject to HOA rules, compensation for harassment, restoration of my right to continue renovations immediately, and a restructuring of lake access agreements that respected all property owners' rights. But the HOA's problems ran deeper than their conflict with me. Once other residents realized how their board had been operating, internal protests erupted. A group of homeowners formed the committee to audit the association's finances, uncovering years of questionable spending and self-dealing. Brandon Williamson's real estate development company had purchased 6 properties around the lake in the past 5 years, all from original owners who had been harassed into selling for below-market prices. In each case, Brandon had used his mother's influence and HOA pressure tactics to drive down the price. The story caught the attention of a journalist at the regional newspaper, who began investigating what he called lakefront corruption. When he contacted me for comment, I provided documentation but emphasized that my goal was fair treatment, not revenge. Margot refused to resign despite mounting pressure. She called an emergency board meeting at the clubhouse, but found the doors locked against her. The interim board appointed after Walter's motion had changed the locks. In a desperate move, she attempted to rally support by organizing a gathering at the community beach. But when she and her remaining allies arrived, they found my property notices had been upgraded to a proper fence with a locked gate and a security camera. A sign on the gate read, "Access to private property temporarily suspended pending legal resolution. Contact interim AGOA board for updates." The interim board, led by Walter, and including Elena and 2 other reform-minded residents, had already begun negotiating with me in good faith. Margot's final public stand became a legendary moment in Lake community law. Standing at the locked gate, face flushed with fury, she demanded someone do something, while filming the confrontation on her phone, presumably for evidence in some future lawsuit. "This is outrageous," she shouted toward my cabin. "You can't hold an entire community hostage." I wasn't home to witness her meltdown, but my security camera caught every moment, including when she attempted to cut the lock with bolt cutters she brought along, only to be stopped by concerned residents who didn't want to add criminal charges to the association's mounting legal problems. The video, which was later obtained through legal discovery and shared widely within the community, marked the end of Margot's reign. Even her staunchest supporters couldn't defend such behavior. By month's end, both Margot and Brandon Williamson had put their lakefront mansions up for sale. The showdown reached its climax in late August at the Clearwater County Courthouse. The judge, brought in from a neighboring county to avoid any appearance of local influence, reviewed the evidence presented by both sides. My legal team had assembled an ironclad case: original deeds and surveys, documentation of the harassment campaign, evidence of judicial misconduct in the original court order, and testimony from multiple property owners about similar treatment. The HOA's attorneys, now focused on damage control rather than victory, attempted to portray the entire situation as a simple misunderstanding about boundary lines that had unfortunately escalated. Judge Martinez was having none of it. "What I see before me," she said, looking over her glasses at the HOA representatives, "is a systematic attempt to use quasi-governmental authority to deprive legitimate property owners of their rights. This court finds that not only is the plaintiff's property not subject to HOA regulations, but that the defendants engaged in a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of process." She continued, "Furthermore, the court finds that the access road and community beach partially encroach on the plaintiff's property and have done so without proper legal authorization. The revocable license granted by the previous owner was valid and can indeed be revoked." The courtroom, filled with residents from both the HOA and the original properties, erupted in murmurs. However, the judge raised her hand for silence. The court recognizes that an immediate closure of access would create undue hardship for many innocent homeowners. Therefore, I am ordering a 90-day period for the parties to negotiate a fair and permanent easement agreement. If no agreement is reached, the plaintiff will be within his rights to restrict access. She then turned directly to me. "Mr. Parker, while you have the legal right to exercise control over your property, I encourage you to consider the impact on community members who purchased their homes with the understanding that they included lake access. Many of these individuals had no part in the actions of the board." I nodded respectfully. "That has always been my intention, Your Honor." Senator Holloway, who had been subpoenaed to testify, but whose testimony ultimately wasn't needed, slipped out a side door to avoid the press waiting outside. As the crowd dispersed, Walter approached with Elena and several other residents, some from original properties, others from within the HOA. "Congratulations," Walter said, shaking my hand. "Though I suspect the hard part is just beginning. Now we have to rebuild this community." Elena nodded. "Many of us have been neighbors for years without really knowing each other because of this artificial division. A woman I recognized as a Clearwater Estates resident stepped forward. "I bought my home 5 years ago. I had no idea about any of this history or what the board was doing. Most of us just wanted to live by a beautiful lake." Over the next several weeks, a remarkable transformation took place. The interim HOA board, working with representatives from the original properties, drafted a new framework for lake governance. Instead of an HOA with overreaching authority, we created the Lake Clearwater Community Association, a voluntary organization focused on genuine community needs rather than controlling property aesthetics. Access to the lake and beach areas was guaranteed through a formal easement agreement, with maintenance costs shared equitably. The restrictive architectural guidelines were replaced with basic standards focused on safety and environmental protection. Margot sold her home to a young family who became enthusiastic participants in community events. Brandon Williamson's development plans were scrapped after his company faced multiple lawsuits from former property owners. Senator Holloway kept his lake house but became conspicuously absent from community affairs. The local newspaper reported he had decided not to seek re-election, citing a desire to spend more time with family. Judge Phillips took early retirement after the Judicial Ethics Committee issued its findings. As summer turned to fall, we held the first ever unified lake community picnic, hosted on my property and the adjacent community beach. Residents from all around the lake attended, many meeting their neighbors properly for the first time. Standing on my completed deck, watching children playing along the shoreline while adults chatted in groups on the lawn, I reflected on how differently things could have turned out. Walter joined me, handing me a cold beer. "You know," he said, "Margot actually did us all a favor in the end. Without her crusade against you, we might never have fixed what was broken here." I raised my bottle in a toast to unintended consequences. "And to knowing where your property lines are," he added with a wink. 1 year later, Lake Clearwater had transformed. The invisible boundary between HOA and non-HOA properties had dissolved, replaced by a genuine community where diversity of homes was celebrated rather than penalized. My cabin renovation was complete, structurally modernized, but maintaining its rustic character. I had decided to split my time between the city and the lake, working remotely when possible. The deck that had once been the center of controversy now hosted regular gatherings for neighbors. Elena had been elected president of the new Lake Association, bringing a diplomat's touch to community issues. The petty violations and aggressive enforcement had been replaced with a focus on actual lake health and safety. Most surprisingly, my technical background proved unexpectedly valuable to the community. I designed a lake monitoring system using sensors to track water quality, helping identify potential contamination sources before they became serious problems. The project brought residents together in a common cause, healing old divisions. The access road that crossed my property was now properly documented with a permanent easement, in exchange for the community contributing to maintaining the shared shoreline and dock areas. What had been a point of leverage became a symbol of cooperation. I occasionally received updates about the former lake tyrants. Margot had moved to an exclusive golf community in Florida, where rumors suggested she was already conflicting with their HOA board. Brandon Williamson had relocated his practice to a different state after the fallout from the ethics investigation. Senator Holloway, true to form, landed on his feet. Though he didn't seek re-election, he secured a lucrative position with a lobbying firm. He still owned his lake house but rarely visited, instead renting it out to vacationers through a management company. The former judge, Raymond Phillips, had the most surprising transformation. After his retirement, he sent me a handwritten letter of apology, admitting he had signed orders without proper review as favors to influential friends. He asked for forgiveness and offered to speak publicly about judicial independence if it would help prevent similar situations. On a perfect June evening, exactly 2 years after my confrontation with Margot, I hosted a lakeside dinner for the neighbors who had become friends. As the sun set over the water, casting golden light across the surface, Walter raised a toast. To Jack, he said, "Who taught us all that sometimes you have to fight for a community worth having?" Elena added, "And to knowing when the fight is over." I smiled, looking around at the table filled with people from all around the lake, original cabin owners and newer residents alike. The irony is that all I wanted was to be left alone with my little piece of lakefront. Instead, I ended up more connected to this place and its people than I ever expected. Later that evening, as my guests departed and I stood alone on the dock that had once been declared a violation, I reflected on the strange journey. My grandfather had loved this lake enough to buy a piece of it when it was nothing special, just a quiet body of water surrounded by woods. His foresight in purchasing not just the cabin plot, but the strip of shoreline had given me the leverage I needed when the battle came. I wondered what he would think of how things had turned out. The lake was certainly more developed than in his day, with fewer wild spaces and more manicured lawns. But perhaps he would appreciate that the spirit of the place, the reason people were drawn to water in the first place, had been preserved and even strengthened. In the end, what defeated Margot and her allies wasn't just legal maneuvering or property rights. It was the recognition by the majority of lake residents that a community imposed through rules and threats isn't really a community at all. As if to punctuate this thought, my phone pinged with a message from the Lake Association group chat. Someone had spotted a family of otters returning to the lake after many years of absence. Within minutes, neighbors were sharing sighting locations and photos, collectively celebrating this small but significant sign of a healthy ecosystem. No architectural committee approval required.